Peter Gahan is an Irish investigative reporter, I think it's fair to say, who lives in, or perhaps with his new job, not less so, two places, London and Glasgow, and has researched his stories in many countries around the world. Last year, he became editor-in-chief at Open Democracy. He led the investigative reporting as editor of investigations. He's also the author of two books. The first is called The People's Referendum, Why Scotland Will Never Be the Same Again, which was published in 2014. And more recently, and in a sense the book that enticed us to invite him to come and talk to us, Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics, which was published in 2020. It's the realities described in the latter book, which Peter will, I think, be talking about now, and also bringing forward, perhaps, into things he's found in pursuing these questions in Open Democracy in more recent months. So this is our concern. This is why we gave ourselves the title Dark Money and the Subversion of Global Politics. And just personally, for me, one of the questions here is, what link can we find between Peter's analysis of this movement of dark money, this new form of political persuasion and manipulation, because that is what we're dealing with, and the sorts of narratives that Norman Cohn was interested in developing a critical argument about. So what we will do, I think, is we will hear from Peter, and then we will have a conversation in which we might try and explore the common territory. And we will, of course, start up here, but we will open to the audience, and we will also be taking questions from the live feed. So thank you for listening to our introductory material. I'll now hand over to Peter and sit here and listen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I was going to stand up, but you're all so close to me, it would feel a bit weird if I stood projected to the back of the room with the wine glasses. So I think, is that a bit echoey? Oh, is that okay? Maybe I'll try not to speak so loud, which doesn't come easily to me. First off, many thanks to Norman Cohn Trust and the Centre for the Critical Study of Apocalyptic and Millenarian Movements. Not least because your centre sounds so absolutely cool. Like, I feel really blessed to have you talking about it. Like, it sounds really, really, really interesting. And I'm quite looking forward to us exploring some Norman Cohn's ideas. You know, I'm not massively familiar with him, but actually I've been really struck with, or I talk to people about him. His work actually certainly permeates other people. It's been quite interesting, even saying I was doing this lecture, people are like, oh, I used to read his work in college and stuff like that. And I'm sure we will probably dig into conversation more into the kind of the more kind of subcutaneous relationships between these things. But the one thing that did strike me was I know that Norman Cohn was very interested in kind of very, very fanatically into stuff. And I guess there's a bit of fanaticism in my work, because as an investigative journalist, you are like kind of always being slightly fanatical about things. So people watch All the President's Men, they think that investigative journalism is kind of skulking around in car parks and meeting people and things like that, and kind of shouting, you know, stop the press at 5 minutes to midnight. And the reality, in some ways, at least in my experience, is quite different. I don't know if you've ever seen the film Spotlight, which is a film about clerical abuse in Boston. And it's my favourite film about journalism, because it's probably the closest to what it's like to do what I do, which is you spend hours and hours, days and weeks, kind of slowly picking away at something. And then you have some sort of eureka moment where it all comes together, but you have to be slowly, fanatically following a thread for it ever to lead anywhere. And it's kind of a grind at times, and it requires a kind of, I think, a kind of, an ability not to let go of something, or at least a kind of a compulsion not to let go of something. And often it means you start your investigations in quite unglamorous places or surprising places. And the genesis of this book started in a very surprising place. In some respects, I'm still amazed that the book exists. It actually started back in a place at Seaburn Metro Station on the outskirts of Sunderland on the 21st of June, 2016. And when I first started doing this, the 21st of June 2016 was 2 days before the Brexit referendum, and I was working as a reporter for the Irish Times. And my editor did that thing that newspaper editors do before a big vote. They send reporters to parts of the country that they've never really heard of, the reporter hasn't heard of either. And they spend the day wandering around talking to people, and then they write this definitive piece about what life is like in X, Y, or Z. So I was sent to Sunderland to report on what voters thought about the European Union just before the Brexit referendum. And fair to say they weren't particularly fussed on the European Union in Sunderland just before the Brexit referendum. By the next morning I was getting ready to leave, and my kind of train came into the platform, and I just got on the train, and next to me was a copy of the Metro, the newspaper, the free Metro newspaper, the free sheet. And the Metro had a big wraparound advert on it that said, "Take back control, vote leave," which, you know, the catchy Leave slogan from 2016, it's still a hit now. It had like a little imprint that said, "Paid for by the Democratic Unionist Party." And I found this very curious, because I used to work as a reporter in Northern Ireland, and I knew a lot about the DUP. I knew that the DUP were not, you know, they were 50 years, almost 50 years old. They never ran a single candidate outside of Northern Ireland. They weren't a political party known for great largesse in election spending, you know, some of the Presbyterian parsimony, but you know, there was no sense that the DUP were big spenders at election time. And I was really struck there buying this huge, expensive ad in the Metro newspaper. So I was like, what was going on? And I also knew something else, because I used to work as a reporter in Belfast, and I knew that political donations in Northern Ireland were kept secret under a kind of a law dating back to the Troubles, because there was a fear that if people were found to have been given political donations, they could be subject to intimidation, threats, or worse. So I was kind of wondering, you know, has someone done something? Had someone tried to use Northern Ireland's anachronistic laws to get around election spending? And I took a little photograph and I posted it on Twitter, and that kind of was the end of it, you know. The train took off, we went past the bits of heavy industry that are left in Sunderland, and I started writing my copy for the next day's newspaper. And 48 hours later, Sunderland voted overwhelmingly to leave the European Union. I think it was about 60% in Sunderland voted to leave. Within, you know, a couple of hours, David Cameron had resigned, you know, everything moves on. And like the whole way along, we had all the kind of pollsters and everybody else trying to explain what happened in the Brexit referendum. And in many ways, Britain for a number of years, maybe still since, has been kind of cauterized by that story. And I guess in the months that followed the Brexit referendum result, I kind of found myself thinking about being back in a train station and that advert. I found myself kind of wondering just what was going on there, what was happening with it, you know? Why was this political party buying these expensive ads? Like, who was paying for it all? And what was interesting was it turned out that Adam Ramsey, who was a young reporter at Open Democracy, was asking the same questions, and he gave me a call in early 2017, and he was said, you know, like, you know, I'm really interested in this. And it's interesting because a few years later, I'm now the editor-in-chief at Open Democracy. I'm Adam's boss. He's still there. And I run a website that's dedicated to public interest journalism. It's all about challenging power and inspiring change. And it often involves digging deep to look at who's influencing our politics, who's influencing our democracy behind the scenes. And, you know, my first taste of working for Open Democracy was this story that Adam and I did. We started this investigation into the DUP's Brexit spending. And we discovered a lot of things. We discovered that the DUP had received £435,000, which is a huge amount of money in Northern Irish politics, for these adverts. And it had been routed through a strange little Scottish group called the Constitutional Research Council, which had been set up by a man who'd gone into business with the former head of Saudi secret intelligence. At times it felt a little bit like a kind of airport novel. Every time you pull the next thread, something kind of dramatic and remarkable happened. And this is a bit in the talk where I should always say that we still don't actually know where that £435,000 came from. So if anybody does know, feel free to come see me afterwards in confidence, you know, and everything, all sources will be treated confidentially. But anyway, so like what was interesting as well was, as I mentioned, this legislation in Northern Ireland, actually that loophole had technically been closed in 2014, but a successive number of Conservative Northern Ireland secretaries had actually never enacted the legislation that was required. So the Northern Ireland donations were kept secret. And so we've published dozens and dozens of stories about this. And eventually the loophole was closed, but interestingly, they didn't. The Conservative Party, who at the time, if you remember, were relying on the Democratic Unionist Party in Parliament, they decided not to, as was easy to do, instead of using the legislation that existed, which would have made public all donations from 2014, they decided to make it just start from the time the new legislation came in, so we still don't know where the money came from. But I found myself, what was interesting about it, and perhaps because my background is investigative journalism, but I'd never actually done much work on money in politics. I'd done a lot of work on things like, I used to work for Channel 4, consumer affairs, labour rights, those sorts of issues. And I think because I hadn't come from that background, I found this whole world absolutely fascinating. I was like, this is really interesting. Like, DUP is interesting, but more generally, like, what's the influence of money in our politics? You know, what's going on? And it's interesting because when it comes to political funding, Britain is a bit like the United States. It's private money that runs politics, whereas in most of Europe, parties are funded by the state. But the difference between Britain and the United Kingdom is that in America, it's huge, big business. We all know how much money, it's a huge business. I think, the 2018 midterm elections cost $6 billion. There's states with less annual turnover, not huge amounts of money. And I think that's really interesting, I think especially since I wrote this book, because, I think when I finished writing this book, there was a bit of me that went, have I gone too far? Have I been too unkind? And a lot of stuff that's happened in the last 12 months has made me go, no, you weren't, you were maybe right a bit too early, and, you could have been much, much less kind than you were. And the way I say that is because in Britain, actually small amounts of money can make a huge difference, because there's so little money. So for £50,000 a year, you can become a member of a thing called a Conservative Leaders Group, which means once every quarter you get to meet Boris Johnson if you want to. So some people like that kind of thing. And his government ministers, and you can have off-the-record meetings and briefings with them where no notes were taken for £50,000. If you remember not last summer, the summer before, there was a scandal to do with Robert Jenrick, the then housing minister, and Richard Desmond, the Tory donor, who saved himself about £50 million when Robert Jenrick intervened in a planning decision to do with a major development in East London. The two men had met each other, sitting next to each other at a Tory party fundraiser. Richard Desmond had bought a table. That was £8,000. £8,000 gets you to sit next to a government minister and show him a video of your new development. This is not huge amounts of money. It's almost in the scope if we all club together, we could maybe, buy a minister for an hour or two. And the other thing that struck me and I think is really interesting is how the nature of political donations in Britain has changed a hell of a lot. So back in the early 1970s, there was a lot of the asset strippers who championed Ted Heath's Conservative leadership, but they were very different from the kind of City of London privatisation crowd that kind of rode in behind Margaret Thatcher. Hilariously, in those days, in the 80s, Lord McAlpine, who is now passed away, so I can't say this, he revolutionised Tory funding, and he reportedly used to wander around the City of London with a bag for cash, and he just put money in it. And remarkably, that wasn't illegal at the time. That was totally fine. And by 2011, when the Tories came back into power under David Cameron, they were really reliant on the City of London. City of London money was a big, big thing for the Tory parties, where about half of their funding came from the City of London. And what's interesting is that after the Brexit referendum, party funding has changed a lot in Britain, and particularly for the Conservative Party, because the pro-business elite that kind of were broadly in favour of remaining in the European Union just left the Tory party in droves, as the likes of the European Research Group became more powerful. And the Tories have also become more reliant on money connected to Russia. So people like Lyubov Chernukin, whose husband was a finance minister under Vladimir Putin, she's given more than £2 million to the party since 2012. So you see a lot of the Tory party has also become increasingly reliant on pro-leave hedge fund, people from the hedge fund world, and this might be something you return to, where they're people who have vested interest in disorganised capital. Yeah, and Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think, is a really interesting figurehead for that, and his father even more so, and some of his father's writings on what the future might look like, I think, do chime with some of Norman Cohn and the kind of people who are interested in apocalyptic visions and millenarian visions. And what's also interesting was the Tory party's funding after Brexit was like a stock market. Whatever, which was kind of negatively correlated with the party's Brexit policy at any given time. So if you remember back all those years ago in early 2019 when Theresa May was all those meaningful votes, oh my word, all the meaningful votes. And at that stage the party's donations went off a cliff. They fell by about half from the previous quarter because the donors didn't like this. They wanted a hard Brexit. And then when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, they all came rolling back in. And there's an interesting question about what happens to politics when it becomes captured by small amounts of private money. And we only have to look at America in that respect to see it, because a lot of American donations do come from a handful of very rich people. You've seen the likes of the Koch brothers, one of whom is now dead, the oil and gas billionaires who massively bankrolled American politics, spending billions of pounds over about 50 years. They funded politicians, they funded kind of shadowy think tanks, they funded, lots of lobby groups. all the kind of lobby on issues like why climate change isn't really a big deal, why low taxes are good for the poor, lots of kind of counterintuitive proposals that nonetheless, similarly with the gun lobby, which unfortunately is still a huge part of American politics. And so money does give donors a chance, I think, to kind of set the direction of politics and where it goes, to lobby, to say we want lower taxes. But political donations can also have quite direct material benefits for the donors. And I spent most of 2020 investigating various aspects of Britain's COVID response, and especially the kind of the public contracts that went to private firms. And I'm sure you no doubt remember when the pandemic hit, there was a huge push to procure PPE, personal protective equipment, as quickly as possible. And the government sent out a call saying, anybody who can help us. So I started being quite interested in this because government contracts were kind of being handed out very quickly. All the normal rules of procurement were going out the window. And so I started off trying to understand how contracting works, because it wasn't something I knew much about. And I spoke to lots of experts who talked me through the process, showed me how the system worked. I kind of used the government portal, which is quite glitchy, but to try and understand what was happening, like who was being hired to run Britain's COVID response. And over the months that followed, I wrote dozens and dozens of articles about COVID contracting. And I think the thing that struck me most was that, Britain's first response in this difficult situation, and ironically, I was actually in Ireland. I went back to Ireland with my mum, so I was kind of watching from afar, and you could see the two countries kind of side by side. And I was really struck that in Britain, the first response for many people in power was to call on their corporate contacts and also people who they knew through politics, through political donors to help. And, in the first 6 months of the pandemic, Britain spent over, 100 billion pounds on this response. Huge amounts of money went on consultancy contracts. For example, Serco was given hundreds of millions of pounds to run the track and trace system. And actually it didn't run as probably being unfair because it just subcontracted it out to about 30 different companies who they were refusing to name. Actually, when I used to FOI them, they said that we can't give you out that because it's commercially sensitive, which is quite bizarre. But I spoke to lots of people who were working in this area as well, some of the contract tracers, and kind of finding out what their lives was like. And what was quite striking was Serco is a very well-connected, politically connected company as well. The company CEO was a grandson of Winston Churchill, a health minister at the time, used to be a Serco lobbyist. And the more I looked at this, the more I saw that this kind of revolving door between politics, between public life and private life in the UK was completely interconnected. And I thought, COVID, I think, for me, revealed the kind of depth of this cronyism and this clientelism in British public life. And that's not really my own opinion. The government's own spending watchdog, the National Audit Office, did a report in which it found that what they called politically connected firms were 10 times more likely to get a government contract. And if you were put in this VIP lane, basically you were kind of quids in, and the sums involved were huge. There's one business was owned by a Conservative donor that supplied beauty products to high street chains and was given £65 million contract to provide face masks to the NHS. Which is quite a good return. A Conservative councillor in Stroud, who ran a small loss-making firm, was given £270 million to supply PPE. There was a strange case of Ianda Capital, which was a family investment that specialised in currency trading and offshore property. They were given £252 million to provide face masks, 50 million of which were never used because of design flaws. And the list goes on. I could sit here for the next hour reading names of companies like that. And actually one day in the summer of 2020, I was doing what I often do in a slightly fanatical way, which is trawling through government transparency releases. And I noticed that a PR firm called Public First had been given a contract for COVID by the Cabinet Office. And I knew Public First because it was run by two long-term associates of Michael Gove and Dominic Cummings, who at the time was not persona non grata in Downing Street, but very much the man at the helm. And I've been given contracts worth more than £1 million without a tender. And on the back of my story, which I did with The Guardian, a court case actually was taken against Public First by the Good Law Project, and Matt Hancock was found to have broken the law. And Matt Hancock resigned, but he didn't resign for that. He resigned because, if you remember, he was caught in an amorous embrace with one of his colleagues. So that's a big no-no, but giving contracts to your mates is pretty much okay. I'm almost finished kind of some aspects of this of my talk, but I kind of would like to return before myself and Patrick speak more to the kind of second part of my title, this idea of the subversion of global politics, because I think I've spoken a bit about the subversion, I think, of our politics here in Britain, our politics that happens just down the road, but I think there's a global aspect to all this that's really important. And I think what's really struck me in doing the work I do is just how globally connected so many of the aspects of this dark money problem are. You know, one aspect of it is what I'd almost call the dark money playbook. You know, the way electoral rules are abused, the way online adverts are used to push misinformation and disinformation, the way in which, frankly, bad actors will take every advantage that they can to funnel money anonymously into the political system. And so there's that aspect of which you can see in lots of different jurisdictions, and there's connections between all around the world when it comes to that. And there's also quite material connections between some of the players that I write about. You know, one of the things, probably the chapters I found most interesting when I was researching and writing my book were the sections in the middle, which is about the think tank world, the world of kind of anonymously funded think tanks. Most of which actually, there's hundreds of them, are based in 2 Georgian tenement houses on Tufton Street, which is not far from here. You know, and the fact that there's hundreds of them in two buildings suggests that there isn't actually hundreds of organisations. There's hundreds of names, which is very much how this works. You set up nominally independent sounding think tanks with names like the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Centre for Policy Studies, which really, you know, are not particular. You know, they sound like research institutes, but a lot of what they are producing is, you know, they're funded by corporations, funded by corporate interests, and a lot of what they're producing would not qualify as research for CENSAM or any of your similar bodies. You know, and I think, and what's really interesting is the connection between these groups from around the world. There's the Atlas network, which kind of links. A fascinating organisation. There's about 450 libertarian think tanks around the world linked together by this thing called the Atlas Network, which actually has its roots here in London originally and was brought to America. And so there's a huge connection between the Heritage Foundation, the big think tanks, the American right, and British think tanks. And all of these organisations, especially the Brexit process, and I write in my book isn't really about, it's not saying that Brexit was stolen or anything like that, but I think what's interesting about Brexit was it kind of probably hypercharged stuff that was already happening in British politics, and I think it also gave some groups like the IEAs of this world, who were kind of marginal, an opportunity to become front and centre of the political world in a way that they hadn't been for a while. And it's striking, I think it's given an opportunity for them to kind of engage with each other. The kind of conservative right, the European Research Group, and people like that, and the kind of aspects of the GOP in the States and the kind of conservative world. But not just that as well, actually. In writing this book, I interviewed Steve Bannon, if you remember Steve Bannon, Donald Trump's impresario, and he was quite interesting because prior to that, in one of my investigations early on, which is in the book, was into a guy called Aaron Banks, who was a big Brexit donor, and I uncovered emails between Aaron Banks kind of writing to Steve Bannon, begging him to help him get around British electoral laws to fundraise in the US. And Steve Bannon was talk a lot about Nigel Farage. So it was very interesting talking to Steve Bannon for this book, actually. And he's clearly a character with a story to tell and a particular worldview. But also he is one of those people who's very much connected to all these different people. And he was talking to me actually about the importance of social media for populist movements, about how Matteo Salvini in Italy, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Nigel Farage, even Trump wouldn't exist without social media. And we saw some of that during the American elections. We've seen huge amounts of spending by political parties on social media, but also the extent to which social media can warp and change political conversations. And I think it's really striking, this, you know, and Steve Bannon, when I spoke to him, really saw it. It's a great, you know, what is unsurprising is the kind of internationalism of nationalists. You know, I think that's a big stride. That's not new. We saw that in the 30s as well, but it's quite interesting to see it's kind of got a almost social media age aspect to it now. And we can see that, I think, in the connections between some of the groups that I write about in my book and international players. You know, Viktor Orban, who recently won another landslide majority in Hungary, you know, we've seen Conservative MPs, a number of Conservative MPs go to give speeches, to go and talk about, express their admiration for Orban's regime. We even saw a group of pro-Brexit libertarians, including Taxpayers Alliance and the Adam Smith Institute, lobbying to establish a museum of communist terror in London, which was inspired by the Budapest attraction. There's a former Thatcher spin doctor, speechwriter, John O'Sullivan, who now works for Danube Institute in Budapest. There's kind of these personal links which run through it. And more recently, what I've become very interested in is I've noticed a lot of these same players have a new target. It's no longer Brexit, that ship has sailed in some respects. And it's opposing net zero and action on climate change. This has become a big aspect of this. And it's funny, I discovered this almost by chance about 6 or 7 months ago, and I wrote a piece about it, which kind of went a bit viral, because I was looking at the Telegraph for my sins, and I noticed they had an advert, or not an advert, they had a story about how a majority of people in Britain wanted a referendum on net zero. I found this really odd. I'd never heard anybody talk about this. I was like, I wonder who's... I'm quite having... The one thing that my book and my research has told me is actually to be very sceptical about stories I read in the media. Because it's really easy to place stories, and it's often not out of badness. Journalists are not... Like, journalists have deadlines. It's a tough... I worked in a newsroom for years. It's a tough environment. And I noticed this story about this polling that said that a majority of people wanted a referendum on net zero. And it was conducted by an organisation called CAR26. This is about a week before COP26. So I went on to Company's House. I noticed that CAR26 was only set up about 3 weeks earlier. And I noticed that one of the people who's the front woman for CAR26 was also a member of, I get confused between Reclaim and Renew and the various different ones. Lawrence Fox's political party, which is underwritten by a guy called Jeremy Hoskin, who was a big Brexit donor. He spent about $5 million on this bizarre vanity project. And I noticed that the polling had been conducted by another group, which was part of the Brexit campaign. And so, but within 24 hours, it was being debated on the BBC's politics show live. So, and it's so that's how easy these things are to transmute from what was effectively, you know, maybe £1,000 budget opinion polling. So it's so easy to kind of influence our political debate. And subsequently, since then, Nigel Farage has announced he's going to set up a referendum, a campaign for a referendum on net zero. The European Research Group has morphed into the Net Zero Scrutiny Group of backbench MPs, or the exact same people, using the exact same tactics in many respects as the European Research Group of MPs did as well. And actually, earlier this month, myself and one of my colleagues at Open Democracy, we published an investigation to the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which has also kind of rebranded as Net Zero Watch. And we revealed that it had received funding from the US, from some of these big US. Almost all of its money comes from the US. Almost every penny the Global Warming Policy Foundation gets comes from the US, or well, over half of it. And what's really striking again is that, you know, in the kind of organisations who are giving money, with Richard Mellon Scaife's foundation, people like that, who spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year in America, and for a couple of $100,000 in the UK, would get huge amounts of media attention, traction, places in the media, conversation points, talking points in Parliament. And I think that's what has me still thinking that the title of my book, Democracy for Sale, is still probably quite relevant. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheetah, I was, well, let's kind of come back to the question of Cohn, just to see what we can do with it. I was intrigued by reading your book again. I realised how you're quite clear in a way that many of the people driving these systems that produce Brexit are really chasing a kind of deregulation, low tax, no tariffs, no economic borders version of turbo capitalism. Yeah? I mean, that's the brief. And yet, much of the journalistic discussion of Brexit was all about the left behind, and it was all about Little England, which, of course, in the 19th century was quite a liberal cause because it was anti-imperialist, but is now seen as a kind of dim-witted backwardness, sort of not being able to move. And I wondered, because so many of the narratives of Brexit were dealing with this other set of problems, And yet the actual driving interest of the people who were scheming and manipulating and hiding money and doing all these things you've described so well, then you get the feeling they don't care about any of that. They're not little nationalists. You know, they're already chopping around all over the world. They have a completely different vision. So how do those two come together? How do those two sides of this new politics come together?
It's a really interesting question. One of the most fascinating books, and actually, I can't remember who sent it to me a few years ago, was a book called The Sovereign Individual, which was written by Jacob Rees-Mogg's father, William Rees-Mogg, formerly editor of The Times. He was a co-author of this book, The Sovereign Individual. And actually, Fintan O'Toole references it in his book, Heroic Failure, but actually the most interesting discussion on it is there's an epilogue to Gabriel Gatehouse's fantastic The Coming Storm podcast, which is all about the rise of QAnon, which he has a kind of an epilogue where he asks loads of questions about Jacob Rees-Mogg and the sovereign individual. And the thesis of the sovereign individual is casting forward. It's kind of written at the dawn of the internet, and it's casting forward into a kind of a world of sea standings, if you don't know the sea standing world, which is the idea that, like, basically in international waters you can live a sovereign life in which your regulations don't exist and you don't pay taxes. But it's going beyond that and imagining some world where there's kind of almost the supermen, the kind of supermen of the world who are unfettered by any demands of the state, any demands of kind of the bonds of nationhood. For a few enlightened souls in this new tech utopia, are able to do in some ways that Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk's of this world are kind of represent. You can see it's in some ways quite a prescient book. It's not without its. But what's quite fascinating about it is the authors are delighted at this prospect. I think it's the thing that does come away with you from reading this book. And fathers and sons aren't identical, but it's not hard to see some echoes of that in Jacob Rees-Mogg's. I don't know how he's, as you say, he's the kind of large investment firms, footloose capital. It's very striking, actually, that this political shift, and I think I had a feeling we might go in this direction, which is one of the reasons I talked about political funding in my talk there. That shift in movement of where money came from, away from the kind of captains of industry of Tory vote, from the 60s, say, which did at least have some bounds in the national economy, some bounds in the productive economy, into like the hedge fund world, into the world of deregulation, unfettered capitalism, where money can be made from chaos, where what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism is there is money to be made, and one of the reasons, I guess, in some ways, the PPE contracts are a good example of disaster capital. That this, when all the kind of usual rules of the game are thrown up in the air, there's huge opportunities to make.
This argument used to be associated with the left. The revolution may cause mayhem, but we'll make a better world. A bright future will come out of it. That rhetoric. But now you're seeing the principle of chaos, a sort of a sense of global collapse, and being a sort of an opportunity to make money, to make more money.
And in a way, I think there's a kind. It's also framed. It's quite striking. I think Jacob Rees-Mogg is genuinely is an interesting character in that respect. He is now the Minister for Brexit Opportunities, and it's easy to scoff at that. But if you actually listen to what he says, the one thing he talks about all the time is the City of London deregulations, getting rid of the BAL rules. That's a big thing, actually. Like, they are things that make a big difference, and that's how much credit a bank has to hold. Like, you reduce that, there's a lot more money to be made, frankly, and money to be lost subsequently. But also, without getting too deterministic on it, it is striking. He's a very doctrinaire Catholic. And I was struck, oddly, as you can probably tell from my accent, I was raised a Catholic. I was struck, actually, just quite as interesting. I wouldn't over-labour it, but quite a number of the strongest voices on, say, the European Research Group are very religious. Much more religious than the norm in Britain. Normally, because I often say that Britain's pleasingly godless. Religion doesn't play the same. I remember when Theresa May became Prime Minister, she had to basically go, nothing to do with me, the whole religion thing. And it's quite interesting, and I think there's a desire for social control at the same time as, so I think it's not just, there's aspects that are both in terms of financial, but also there's a desire for control. And I think you can see that played out in America very, very strongly, actually, these two things which, and you can actually see it in some of the libertarian, there's a kind of interesting kind of, without labouring the point too much, the Peter Thiels of this world, the PayPal billionaire, who actually in many respects is very, very, very doctrinaire socially. So I think, in some ways, there's a revolutionary aspect to this, because there's also often a story of moral decay. There's a story of making money and a story of moral decay, which are kind of locked in with each other. And I didn't speak about it there, but there's a chapter in my book that talks about a group called the World Congress of Families, which is a very fascinating organization. My colleagues at Open Democracy have done a lot of work in the World Congress of Families, which is a group that was set up by very, very right-wing American Christians and very, very conservative Russians around Putin, people like Konstantin Malafeyev. Yeah, and we published a few stories in the last couple of months about them, but I thought more people would in the back of the invasion of Ukraine. But what this group started up in the 90s was, pushing very, very, very hard doctrinaire Christian lines. Very close to Viktor Orban, a number of their annual conferences have taken place in Budapest. Matteo Salvini addressed their conference in Verona, I think it was 2018 or 2019, ahead of the European elections. And what you can see, I think, is a similar space, is a similar kind of, it's the internationalization of nationalism, a very strong focus on social control, but similarly, it's a series of interlocking narratives which are kind of in a way tapping into some sort of revolutionary conversation as well. Unsurprisingly, the monetary aspect, which is what I focus on, is very often not the thing that's discussed. So that you rarely hear the conversation about the money flows and how how that side of these operations work.
Now you've also taken in the book, you've gone back quite a long way. You go back into the 70s quite a lot. You attach this the politics of in this country we've seen around Brexit, and which other countries have seen in different manifestations. But you've attached it to the sort of the 70s attack on the state. Many of the same people are involved. So there's a sense in which we're dealing with a kind of set of outriders of the Conservative Party, sometimes in, sometimes further out, who have worked to dismantle the post-war settlement and all that supposed common culture that came out of 45, and who have then found Europe as an alternative to the domestic state, having sort of brought that into whatever shape they're prepared to be bordering that. Do you know what I mean? They've sort of moved on. So there is a kind of strong sequence here, which runs through several decades. But you've also talked, interestingly, I think, about the media situation. So you've got Berlusconi in there as an early example of a leader who decides there is a politics in just reinventing yourself but being visible every day. A sort of truthless politics, if you like, but omnipresent. And you've also talked about Pepe Grillo and the Five Star Movement. I thought maybe you could give us a sense of how this leads you into an analysis of what social media have done to politics. Because I think that's where it goes.
Yeah, I actually found Pepe Grillo really fascinating, because I found myself, because this book was a product of, it was written on the back of a lot of investigations. I actually written, frankly, pretty quickly. In the second half of 2019, and then the pandemic slowed it all down, but at that stage the book was pretty much locked. And in a funny way, I think it was my previous book, because you mentioned there about the Scottish book, which was 2014, so if you remember, the referendum was September 2014. With aspects of this book, I tapped into some stuff that, had I spent a couple of years later, I might have missed, that were better for being fresh. And they might have been manifestations I would dismiss as not being very important. And that's a precursor to kind of, it's almost like an apology for those who read the book and go, why is he writing about this? And what I mean is, I became very interested in this idea of the Brexit Party, which in retrospect looks like a nothing thing. It looks like a nothing burger, a kind of short-lived, odd political movement that started, Nigel Farage, purely a Brexit manifestation, tops the polls, disappears, you can tie it to the story of one man as a disruptor. But I was very interested in it because, and what I was interested in was this idea of a digital party. The party had it was kind of like a fake digital party too. It wasn't really online either, but it had none of the manifestations of a normal political party. It had no members. You gave money into a PayPal account. It was a kind of it was, in one level it was kind of like pure spivery. But I was really interested in what, it felt like I was tapping into a different conversation, and that was this idea of a different place where politics could take place. And I was very interested in the work of Paolo Gerardo, who's at he's at LSE, who's written a lot about digital parties as well, which I thought was really interesting. This idea of like where does politics go online? And the kind of digital party is the Five Star Movement. The Five Star Movement initially was, kind of the first one. And I've got to know very well, Darren Lacadis wrote a great long read in The Guardian around the time of the European election in 2019 about Farage and Pepe Grillo and the Five Star Movement and how Farage's interests were in them. And actually Steve Bannon backed up a lot of what was in Darren's piece too. And Farage went to Milan and met the party. And it was really interesting because in the middle of all this, the data was a big key to all this. It was all about harvesting data really. It was almost like political parties as data harvesting operations. But also the ability to kind of like to present the digital party as being as a renewal of democracy. We were all participating in this. It's a new manifestation of participatory democracy. Whereas in many respects, actually what you end up with is an even more centralized control because it's kind of who controls the data, who's in control of the mechanisms, who controls the whole mechanisms of the party actually controls everything because you do away with branches because you're all online. So it's a really fascinating manifestation. And the Five Star Movement has floundered for political reasons, and the Brexit Party doesn't exist anymore. But I feel like there's still something really interesting in that. I find it hard to imagine that there won't be new iterations of this sort of digital party in which there's a huge amount of media manipulation of the image of the leader. There's a huge amount of ability to manipulate the conversations that go on, and that was one of the really interesting things about the Five Star Movement. If you see it with other political movements too, you see it in the online space. And far more even when I wrote this book, where you have your outriders, you have your bots, you have all of these different, aspects of digital conversation that are used to kind of to manipulate how politics operates. And I think that to me is something I think is fascinating because there's the scope, there's a kind of aspect for everything in journal where you can only measure, you can only know what you can measure, and in the same way that we now report a lot about what people spend on Facebook ads. Journalists do. I've done it too because there's an ad library that you can use, but there's actually a whole other world of social media and of politics that's happening that is actually really hard to keep track of, really hard to understand what's operating in it. And I think I was really struck by the Five Star Movement's genesis, how it had come forward, how it operated, and I feel like within that, there's opportunities to pick up some of these different building blocks and kind of reconfigure them in new ways.
The last question from me. Your book is interesting partly because I read it with a view to understanding Putin a bit. I like so many of us, I'd like to know who's taking the money. Is the dark money from Putin? How much of it? Reading your book, I realised that a great deal of it, of course, is not from Putin. A lot of it is from within this country.
Yeah.
And a lot of it also, a great deal of it, is from what you or they that you describe called the Anglosphere, comes in from America.
Yeah.
So were you surprised by the way that worked out? I mean, the way the quantities played out, the degree of influence?
No, because what's interesting is influence. It depends where you are connected into the system of influence, if that makes sense. And I think how international, what it is you're trying to ascertain, what you're trying to get. So in Britain, we invited in huge amounts of Russian money. Some of it went into politics, but most of it went into the entire kind of enabling industry, PR, lobbyists, estate agents, law in a huge way, all of that. So that's where a lot of the money ended up. So it kind of often ended up in the back pockets of politicians, but in quite a circuitous way. They might have, like a number of members of the House of Lords, gotten on the board of, large Russian interests and received money in that way. Similarly, the Saudis don't invest in British politics, but they've huge sway in other ways. The arms industry and the Saudis are completely and utterly interlinked. So there's huge other ways in which political influence happens. And so what then kind of struck me is how, as you say, money from the Anglosphere, money from people who look out towards that direction, how great that was. But even since I've written my book, what I'm also increasingly struck by is the kind of random spivery, frankly, of a lot of our major political donors. If you look at the biggest donors, the Tory party now, like, a lot of them are people you've never heard of. Some of them are people you couldn't find. Some of them are people who don't, take advantage, so the Conservative Party takes advantage of, they've never changed this, they won't let the Electoral Commission change it. Only British citizens or Irish citizens can donate, so you have to British citizenship or be a dual national to be able to donate to a political party. But a British registered company can donate. A British registered company doesn't actually have to do any trading in Britain to donate to political parties. So you can set up a company on your phone now in about half an hour, and you have to do that, and then you can donate to political parties. So quite a huge amount of money now goes through companies to British political parties, and frankly, it is mainly the Conservative Party. So there's a kind of it's a constantly evolving thing, I think, is the really interesting and important part of it. But when it comes to things like, I think what we've seen with the invasion of Ukraine, since the invasion of Ukraine, is this kind of I've been slightly shocked with I can't believe this is going on. I can't believe, rich Russians used Britain to launder their reputation. Like, have you walked around London? Have you seen, have you watched a football match? This has been a huge, and I think it's about thinking about influence in ways, like political donations is one form of influence, but there's lots of other forms of influence that will kind of change, and I think, frankly, massively corrupt the body politic.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Anyone would like to take the conversation in different directions? Yes, please. Do I need my thoughts? Thank you very much.
Enjoyed that. And I just want to pick up on a very interesting point I think you made in the discussion about religion. I mean, maybe I would ask this question. But, and Rees-Mogg and the Catholicism and the type, I should say, of Catholicism, the rhetoric of Catholicism that goes with it. Because I think you're absolutely right. In this country, or let's just say England for now, you have to have a kind of decaffeinated religion. It's nice, tolerant, sweet, nothing too much. None of the details, none of the ritual, none of that crazy stuff, But there's an exception. One of the exceptions was Thatcher, and it's this establishment kind of thing, isn't it? That you can come as an outsider using it. But I think the interesting thing was Rees-Mogg is interesting because where it's failed religion was Tim Farron. As soon as he starts talking about all this stuff, he was out. But Rees-Mogg was making a very, very similar argument on same-sex marriage, but it didn't hurt him whatsoever. And I've seen this certain type of Catholicism, that's why I don't want to generalise, obviously, about Catholicism, on sort of in alt-right circles, and it's worked somehow, and I can't quite put my finger on why, but I think it's because you can deflect to the church and Rome. Every time there's a problem, you say, well, I just agree with the church's point on this, and no one's going to criticise that in Parliament. No, there's not enough anti-Catholicism, if you like, in British politics to be able to say something like that. But it's a phenomenon. But I think that's as best I can do as an explanation. There is that sort of protection to bat it off, whereas Farron had to say, well, the Bible says, and then everyone can just pile in and says, well, what about this verse in the Bible? But the Catholic Church gives you that protection, or the rhetoric, I should say, of the Catholic Church gives you that kind of protection, I think.
So the other thing that's striking is they're mainly Anglo-Catholics, which is quite strange. There are not many Irish Catholics. They're almost all Anglo. So you've got Ian Duncan Smith is Anglo-Catholic as well. I think Liam Fox is an Anglo-Catholic. Given that most of the Catholicism in the country is Irish, it's quite striking. It's working. Yeah, it's mainly Irish and working class. There's a lot of Catholics. Not Anglo-Catholicism is not a massive strain of the Catholic Church. But it's quite in this country, so it's quite interesting. I think there's something in it. Steve Baker's a born-again Christian. I wouldn't belabor it too far, but there is something within it that I do think it's because it, and partly I think because it does speak to some of these divides in America too. And I don't think we're on the cusp. What's interesting is that I think it's allowed views and positions that in the scheme of British politics are really, really quite fringe. Like on issues like abortion, which in some ways are just not, even in the conservative right, are not issues. To kind of have some, I think this, and I'm not totally sure, I wouldn't, as I say, I wouldn't overdo it, but I think there's something interesting in it.
It is the case that I took a look a few months ago at the membership of the ERG. I thought they would all be male Conservative MPs. Yeah, and most of them were, but there were also about 10, maybe not 10, about 10 female Conservative MPs, and most of them were either Catholic or, in their little blurb on Wikipedia or whatever it was, they wanted to talk about their religiosity and how important that was to them, or they were the other 2 or 3 were from the Asian community. So it was a set of women who I think hardly any of them were straightforward, white British women of the Protestant, and the 1 or 2 that were very clear about their personal religiosity. So, and if you go back to the early 19th century, I'm a historian, the era of when the new Poor Law was created, which was a kind of movement away from more traditional ideas of mercy and charity being what Christians were about. It's clear that, there were 2 or 3 strong ideological strands behind that, one of which was classical political economy, one of which was Benthamite utilitarianism. But another one was a strand of providential evangelicalism, of which William Sumner, who later became Archbishop of Canterbury, sat on the Royal Commission, and he was a key figure holding that view. And these were people who thought that the economic sphere, and they understood it through the new ideas of political economy, was a sort of moral testing ground for individuals. And, those who did not work for a living engaged had failed morally, and, they had to be rescued, but they were, and those who did work industriously and well and who created wealth, well, they were the saved. They were. So I'm sure it's not exactly the same ideology today, but one can see, seeing as we've got the workhouse back, or as I think Philip Alston called it, the digital workhouse, there may be that there is some of that kind of thinking that is going on.
Good. Did you have a question here? Sure. Yes.
Hi, thanks for your excellent talk. I'm Jason Pack. I've written a book, Libya and the Global Enduring Disorder, which it was funny to hear so many of the themes of my book with a slightly different accent. But I have two questions. And the first is, you've touched on, I would say, the core principle of my work, which is a range of interconnected, both sovereign actors as well as individuals and non-state groups, as well as multinational corporations, who benefit from disorder. And the political ways in which, say, Putin or Orban or Bolsonaro or Trump benefit from disorder are well covered, and we need not rehash them. You said something on the economic front which resonates with certain things that my research has uncovered. You talked about ways in which hedge funds might benefit from a quote-unquote disaster capitalism. And of course, this is very paradoxical to lay people because obviously something like Brexit or Trump did not improve the economies of the United States or US. And if you're in a spider fund, your funds have not gone up. I'm not completely convinced by the argument of the benefit of disaster capitalism is for corrupt access to contracts, although for some individuals it may be. You talked about ways in which volatility in and of itself, and you could see some certain kinds of quants and high-volume traders might benefit. So I wanted to ask, and because this is a long question, I'll stop with one, unless there's more time later. What kind of a hedge fund in specific would benefit from this more disordered universe? And I'm not talking about deregulation, but actually the huge volatility of, say, the pound that we're experiencing, or the events in Ukraine and the price of Brent crude changing so rapidly?
It's a really interesting question, and I think when I was writing this book and I was kind of reflecting on some of this, so there's a guy called Crispin Odey, who was actually married to Rupert Murdoch's daughter, and he used to be a Tory, I think, a Tory donor. He'd been, and interesting, this is a side actually, a lot of the same actors who were involved with the Vote Leave campaign were involved with the No to AV campaign back in 2011. He used very similar tactics, and Odie is one of the donors to that, and I think he spent about £900,000 on the Brexit referendum. Well, famously, I think it was BBC or Channel 4 made a film on the referendum night, and they interviewed various people. And he made a fortune shorting sterling on the night of the referendum because the pound collapsed. And so he was kind of headed as a poster boy of that sort of world, this kind of capitalism that doesn't care about anything else. But there's also, and I think there's some truth to that, but also there's something about characters in hedge funds that's quite interesting as well, as people hedge funds. The people who are hedgies. They're not, in, say, in the City of London, they're not the pinstripe city boys. They're rarely the people who went to Oxford, to Eton and Harrow. So they kind of sit outside and have a tendency to see themselves in quite iconoclastic terms. They see themselves as almost masters of disorder. So there's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy aspect to it too. So there's a personality aspect, I think, to some extent, where hedgies and hedge fund managers do tend to see themselves in a different way to your kind of spider fund, your traditional kind of Goldman Sachs banker type. And so there's probably, and I think that's quite important. I think there's an element in which there's profit to be made from it, and they feel like we can make money from volatility, and they feel like there's money to be made within volatility. But also there's a kind of personalized story of I'm the disruptor. I'm the master of my own narrative, and I'm a disruptor. And I'm disrupting this, I'm disrupting what's going on around me. And I feel confident I can profit in it. I'm not one of the little guys, and somebody who's, so I feel like there's a kind of interesting personal, I'm totally agreeing in terms of the kind of, the profit from disorder side of things. And I think when it comes to things like volatility, certain hedge funds with certain positions, and there's also there is money to be made in frankly, hedging. So like, for example, Jacob Rees-Mogg, so I think Somerset Investment, which is based over in Victoria, they opened a Dublin branch about 24 months before Brexit. So there's the opportunity to kind of to sit in different spaces, and I often think what you're looking for now as an outcome is often not one defined outcome. I think that's where often when people think about money in politics, I think you're right actually. The contracts is kind of it's probably a segue I use because it's quite an interesting story. I think that's rarely what money in politics is about. It's rarely about a one-for-one translation. It's more often about setting the world in a place where you think it is. So I think it's rarely about this particular type of volatility I want. It's a particular type of world I want for a bunch of different reasons, some of which can actually be personal as well as political, if that makes sense.
Do you have have you got anything from the feed? Sorry, it's just, are there any questions there that I should? No. No, okay, good. Were you going to start? I will move on just quickly, yes.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I've got a fully formed question, but I'll put something together. All of these political movements and themes were heavily contested in all sorts of different ways. So Brexit, as we know, these different agendas and narratives really around the nature of Europe and the nature of Britain, and the same for net zero. I guess it's moving in that direction now, these narratives. And I just wonder whether, sort of reflecting on people who joined millenarian movements in history, etc., there's a moment that comes when an individual who is not benefiting in any practical way makes a decision to give up everything they have and join a movement. And the Brexit especially was a case of people in ballot boxes making a vote who, many of them were not picking up any money from this process. I just wonder whether the focus on money, first of all, de-emphasizes the importance of these ideas, the contestation around ideas, and not just that, the contestation around imagination about, in the materialized study, often what the world can be like, but maybe just about what Britain could be like or what Europe could be like. And do we miss something if we emphasize the money too much, which, at the end of the day, the person in the ballot box or the person going net zero or changing their boiler or spending money doing that is that's what presumably plays on their mind.
I think it's a very, I would, I kind of say at the start, like I think the reason I ended up doing this because I felt like actually this wasn't been written about, and in some ways when I started writing about this wasn't something people were writing about enough. I felt, I felt like we had so many stories about the red man in the red wall, or the kind of a very stereotyped vision of that too. I felt like I saw a lot of vox pops outside, like working men's clubs in Sutton Coldfield and none in the golf club in Sevenoaks, where most people voted for Brexit too. So I was quite, I think there is something in that. But the counterpoint about the materiality is, I think, what you're talking about is, especially when it comes to, like, the materiality is also a product of the idea space that exists around it. And like, so you mentioned, to kind of go backwards, you talked about I talk about the 70s and stuff that happened in the book quite a lot. And I'm slightly fascinated by a man called Anthony Fisher. Anthony Fisher is a guy who set up the Atlas Network, he set up the IEA, he set up about 500 think tanks over the course of his life. He was a British man who ended up moving to America. And Anthony Fisher was just post-war 1950s. Fisher and a guy called Major George Smedley, who was an army veteran. This was a time when the Conservatives, this is a long-winded answer, but I'll get there. When the Conservatives and Labour were both very much in favour of state intervention. There was a kind of consensus, the post-war consensus, and he didn't like this at all. He was like, he said it was anti-free market. And he went to see Friedrich Hayek, the famous Austrian economist who was at LSE. And he said to Hayek, I'm thinking about getting involved in politics. What should I do? And Hayek said, don't be stupid, don't get involved in politics, it's a waste of time. Why do you want to be standing out, parroting what someone else says to you? What you want to be is getting the ideas that are on the table. You want to be the person, whose ideas have been parroted, not the other way around. What you should do is just to set up a think tank. You set up a think tank and you push out these ideas, and you put them out into the world. And that was Fisher's. Fisher created a panoply of think tanks that all said the same thing in different flavors, but pretty much exactly the same thing. Like the answer to every problem was the same thing. And those ideas took a long time to percolate. There was, every couple of weekdays, the IEA through the 60s and 70s would have MPs and influential people who come for lunch. They would meet with other people, etc. You get newspaper columnists. It takes a long time for ideas to percolate out. Keith Joseph was a big aficionado of them. Adam Curtis does a very good job in the Mayfair set of mapping some of this work. And what's fascinating, I think, the reason I say all this is that materiality and ideas matter. The curly sandwiches at 2:30 in the afternoon matter. Someone has to foot the bill. And this is my point. Like sometimes it's tiny amounts of money which make a big difference. So there's a chapter in the book about the European Research Group, which was this kind of moribund thing for 20 years. I interviewed a bunch of the old members, Tory MPs, and just every so often was a research paper. Then they hired a couple of pretty whizzy research associates who didn't do any research, but knew how the media worked. And next thing you know, they were all over the place. And I think it is important. I think you need to fuel that imagination. Those imaginations you're talking about, the fuel of those comes from somewhere. They're the ideas. And so if you can afford to be there with the ideas, and it doesn't take a huge amount of architecture, but that's what I'm interested in. So it's not money is part of it, but it's not always purely for a vested interest. You should never. The one thing I will say is you shouldn't underestimate how many people just do believe in things. They get money because they do believe in the thing. Like money is less at times the reason why someone believes in something, and not always. It can be the facilitator for someone who believes in the thing anyway, but it can also then facilitate lots of other people believing in it too.
Is it also true that most of the ideologies that the 20th century lived by are in complete collapse?
Yeah,
they're in.
Yeah.
I mean, people pretend they're still there, but they're not.
No, and that's what kind of was. Yeah.
Meaning is very volatile.
Yeah.
Meaning is important, but it's also very wild.
I found it writing this book too, even how he described it. Does Thatcherite work anymore? There's actually in Steen writing about these kind of libertarian think tanks. Libertarian doesn't work at all as a word for him. It doesn't work. I don't really know. And dark money think tanks, which is true because they don't declare their funders, which is one of my big things. It just feels such a kind of jaundiced way of talking about them. So I really struggle to know what to say about them. So I say Tufton Street. But to call this Thatcherism, it probably isn't really on most people's. And Steen Westlake, who's now at the Royal Statistical Society and would be kind of from the right of the Conservative Party at one level or economically at one point, talks about kind of cosplay Thatcherism. I think there is something in that because you're right, these ideas are, and you see it with this government now. The government's a weird, unholy mix of people talking about you know, we need to get cut 25% of civil service so we can have tax cuts. You know, how does that work? You know, and like, it just is a kind of weird hodgepodge of things that are supposed to, you know, and no, I think it is. I think there's a kind of, and I think that's where the other thing we were talking about, the sense of, for some, the sense of some idea of what the future looks like, that is also bound in with some ideas of social control, is actually quite compelling for some.
Good. Have we got any more questions or observations? Or I know, yes, got that.
This is not my field at all, but thinking of the relationship between what that gentleman referred to, the person in the voting booth, in relation to dark money. I mean, well, a few of us here anyway are getting on a bit. Not everybody, I'm pleased to say. But, and we probably are old school and maybe even read newspapers and take time to research subjects. But the vast majority of those actually now in polling booths are a new generation and the one below whose information on the whole is coming from what we call social media. So he who pays the piper plays, plays the tune. I've got that wrong. Thank you. In other words, you've referred to social media. It's a massive subject, but presumably the bots are funded as much as the people who are putting out this stuff, and the stuff goes to people who've already read that stuff, and so on and so on and so on. So my question is really, is that, in the end, is that where the money is most effective? Because this is not just the future, it's the present, this type of influence. What may be happening in the corridors of Westminster is one thing, but in the village halls of voting booths, where is the information coming from? Because some of the traditional catchment areas for the traditional political parties have really disappeared.
Certainly true that a lot of, as you said, traditional catchment areas political parties have. I think in some ways the age thing is quite interesting, because if you look at it, like, you know, a lot of older voters take in a lot of this information on places like Facebook too. So I don't think it's necessarily just a simple kind of young and old thing. I think certainly what you've seen, I think, and you see it in politics, but you see it in other spheres as well. You know, the creation of echo chambers and filter bubbles within which, you know, lots of political conversation happens in certain very pronounced ways. I think we're still unfortunately very much in the infancy of what the internet's going to do to our politics. You know, and that's why I think one reason I ended up writing something about the digital party, like this interest in trying to think through what does the internet mean to politics? What does it mean to what a political conversation looks like? How, again, as you said, like how is money spent online? What's the kind of things that you see? We see actually we see a lot of it actually during the in Russia, Ukraine, and during the war. We're seeing a lot of kind of online disinformation happening. But often I think it is important. It often links with other types of media too, like old media coalesces with new media, like influencers coalesce with like traditional ways of doing things. I think that, to me, is still the kind of thing that is, you know, there's still an imprimatur that comes from, say, getting your story into a newspaper and into a news outlet. But the mechanisms why this happens are really quite hollow and are becoming hollower and hollower as the media industry becomes hollower and hollower. So that in some ways they can kind of start to meet each other in not a very good way at all. And I think that to me is a big part of it. And also we lack, you know, when it comes, there's a couple of interesting books out now on social media, but like how we even think about the role of what we call platforms, but really they're more like shopping malls, and they attract people in and they keep them there, and how they influence what, you know, the kind of words like the extent to which different algorithms can influence what people see. That's a huge issue, you know. And I think that to me is as big an issue as anything to do with like illegal act or illicit or inauthentic behavior on social media. It's the power of, you know, tech platforms that have very little oversight, if any, on how our world is run.
Thank you very much indeed. That's been very interesting. I think we have to assume that our democracy staggers on, and we don't quite know how or why, where the renewal will come from. But it's a very interesting body of work. I would really recommend the book if anybody wants to chase up more on this. And thank you all for coming. And we'll continue. Those of us who are here in the old-fashioned way will find there's a glass of wine and some water at the back, and we can perhaps continue the conversation there. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.